evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started this evening, and we just want to acknowledge that with time change and everything else going on, that people may want to be watching this when they have the time. We will be making this video available on YouTube, so feel free to share it and watch it at your leisure. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and jump right in. We already had our announcements in our waiting room, so we're just going to jump right into the main event. I want to thank Ebony, Tammy, and Adar for being here with me tonight to discuss these underreported events, things that are happening in our country. We're seeing manifestations of January 6th happening on the legal level now in this country. That, January 6th was almost like this really violent visual and physical representation of what's been brewing in this country since its inception, as far as racism and white supremacy. And since then, it's not like it just stopped after January 6th was over. We now have seen that lawmakers are coming up with all sorts of bills to, keep Black and brown people from voting, amongst many other things that we're going to talk about tonight. So and also we want to acknowledge, the history in this country, especially when we talk about the Reconstruction era and we talk about, a white lash or a white backlash that happens when it's perceived that Black people in this country have gotten preferential treatment, that there is this historical white lash that happens in this country. We saw it during the Reconstruction movement with the formation of groups like the KKK. We're seeing it again today because we had a Black president, Barack Obama. And so we're now living in this time now where we're seeing different legal things that are happening to push back on political power of Black people in this country. And so we want to begin with talking about a city here in this country, Jackson, Mississippi. Jackson, Mississippi is 83% Black. Many of us are aware of the, racial history in Mississippi, of racial strife in this country. Some people might feel like it's almost the epicenter for things that have happened in this country, right? With slavery, Reconstruction, and things like that. And so what is happening right now in Jackson, Mississippi, in a city, once again, that is 83% Black with a Black mayor, is that white lawmakers have introduced a bill wherein they would be able to not elect, but put into place judges that would then take control of the city. So the city already has lawmakers that control their city, but we have white lawmakers that live outside of Jackson that now want to control that city. And so we actually talked about Jackson, Mississippi and the water crisis the last time we had this event. And since then, that city has been awarded $800 million by the federal government to fix their water crisis. And so now the white lawmakers in that area want to control that money. And so this is, some people are calling it apartheid. And we want to talk more about what's happening in Jackson, because it's also being replicated in other cities across the country and could be replicated in even more cities. So giving some of the background to what's happening in Jackson, would anyone else like to add to that? Adar, you're on mute.
Thank you. The thing that I would also say that is so important to this conversation is that they're also talking about an expanded police force, militarized police force that would be under the control of this white citizens group. And that is going to have a lot of impact on that city, which is 83% Black. And the other thing that they're using to justify this is that this is about crime, not about money, but about crime. And so these Black people, the Black citizens, need to be policed by their white overseers.
I was going to add too, that they're also, right, the mechanism that they're trying to use is to make an end run around voters and their rights to make their own choices for their own city and for the operation of that city, right? So I think we're looking at something that looks constitutional, but it's really meant to subvert the actual constitutional process that these citizens should have to make these choices themselves.
Thank you, Tammy. So once again, so basically trying to go back to pre-civil, the Voting Rights Act, right? That's basically what they're trying to go back to in this city. Thank you for that, Tammy.
So and another historical piece, and I found this really moving backwards, with all due speed, right? That it was State Representative Trey Lamar who introduced this bill. He is in the seat that was once held by his grandfather, who in, I believe the year was 1962, introduced legislation to stop James Meredith from being able to sue to get into the University of Mississippi. So, past is prologue. People want to talk about the progress that has been made while ignoring the ways in which the country is moving back, and also making invisible the white ideology, the white nationalist, white supremacist ideology, which is using legal means to push us backward.
Thank you, Adora.
I was going to say an additional layer to this too is that when they're talking about having control, right? Because we're talking about giving control to handpick judges, to handpick prosecutors, to handpick these people that are not even going to be from the community. And the language is that we need to choose the best and the brightest, so it means that they'll probably have to come from outside Jackson, which is assuming that the folks that live in Jackson, this 83% Black majority, cannot even make decisions for themselves, that they are somehow inferior to their masters, to their white masters who have to make these decisions, that they can't even choose from the neighborhoods themselves the right people to do the governing. Just an additional layer of racism, an additional layer of marginalization, oppression.
Thank you for that, Tammy. Yeah, and the other thing is that within the state of Mississippi, outside of Jackson, they have a white supermajority, not because of the numbers, but because they've already used things that should be illegal, practices like gerrymandering and other things to already create a white supermajority within the state outside of Jackson. So it's like, even if we don't have the numbers, we're going to create a system in which we can maintain control.
I remember when the Voting Rights Act was gutted, right? And one of the things that the Supreme Court said was that the states in the South should not be held hostage to this Voting Rights Act, which was from a time where it was needed, but now it is no longer needed. And so here in present time, Congress has dragged its feet on every single piece of legislation that would provide more protection to voters of color in the South, and particularly African-American voters, because those are the people who are being targeted. And so now we are seeing all of this going on, not just in Mississippi, but in other states as well. And so we see why the Voting Rights Act continues to be needed. But what makes this unreported news is that nobody is making these connections between the past and the present. And nobody is talking about this for what it is, which is snatching voting power away from African-American citizens in a way that was seen in the 60s, the 70s, before the Voting Rights Act passed. So what the Supreme Court did, their assessment, which was an assessment of a majority white Supreme Court, set the stage for what is happening right now. And this is off course, but this is yet another reason why not only representation belongs on the Supreme Court, but people with a knowledge of U.S. history, why they belong on the Supreme Court.
I also think it's really important for people not to fixate on racism looking the same way as it always looks. And so I think people, when I think about the statement that we are no longer in that time, I think people are looking for burning crosses. People are looking for fire hoses and looking for dogs, and like you can find that if you look hard, but the more insidious way that it moves is that it is in these little things, like these small little changes. So not allowing people to get water or snacks while waiting to get to like vote, and removing, like shrinking down, so doing that on top of getting rid of polling sites so that there are going to be longer lines, and we are in a warmer climate where like people are probably going to want water. So it's not going to look the same way. It's going to look like something that is not as heinous, I would say, because it's not like verbatim hurting somebody's body in that way, but it is taking away people's rights to make decisions about the money that's impacting their community. And we see this happening on local level, and we see it happening on the national level. So I think that people have to kind of switch their gaze from looking for something that like someone, I mean, there are people out here shouting the N-words, you could find them, but it's also how people are maneuvering like how folks are making these political moves to make sure that populations, particularly Black populations, don't have access to make the changes. So I think there's a couple of, I just looked up a couple of different articles now talk about white lash, but the first one the first one I knew of was by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and it was after Trump was elected, and it just talks about how every time Black people make progress in history, throughout the history of this country, we have an even stronger white lash, which is like the very intentional degradation of the progress that was made. And so people have to kind of know what advances were made in order to look at where the attack is going to be. And we have to be a little bit more strategic about what we are looking for to be the evidence of racism.
Mm-hmm. You know, for me, great points, Ebony. And I would also add to that the way that it looks is that white America does not mind any of this going on as long as it is sold softly and subtly. You know, when it is James and Jane Crow Esquire with a suit and a nice cut, then white America is okay with that. If it is bodies in the street and people being, you know, hit with water hoses and dogs, then white America will not be okay with that. That's a little too in your face. But the soft, the more subtle, where they really don't have to look at it, right? In that way, where it doesn't have to, where they have plausible deniability in what they see, then that's a different story entirely, and it is a lot more palatable to many white people in the United States.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Ebony, for those comments, because I think that one of the biggest fallacies that people have kind of put forth is like, oh, we just have to wait for old white racist people to die, right? As soon as these young people come in, and studies have shown that young white Americans are basically taking on the same thoughts and attitudes of the families they're coming from, right? Those numbers are not really changing the younger that we're skewing here in this country. And like Ebony said, it is morphing, it's changing. And that is one of the attributes that racism has always had, that it's always been adaptable and morphed and changed with the times. It's not a thing that's just going to go away. And that's why we have to have these conversations. That's why we have to take action. That's why we have to push back, because it's going to continue to happen.
Which we see with some of these lawmakers that are, you know, second, third generation lawmakers making the same laws in the same places. They know, and yet they still come back with things over and over again, claiming that they didn't realize or whatever.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The assumption of white racial innocence.
Mm-hmm. Thank you all. I want us to also talk about, since we're, on this vein of the ways in which racism morphs, this example is not so much of a morph, but kind of harkening back to things from the past. We have a Representative Paul Sherrill, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, from Nashville, Tennessee, who recently proposed that for corporal punishment in his state, that maybe they should start hanging people by trees, which is lynching. And I want to read, I guess some people claim this is an apology, but I want to read quickly for you all his once he got pushback, this is what he had to say. My exaggerated comments were intended to convey my belief that for the cruelest and most heinous crimes, a just society requires the death penalty in kind. Although a victim's family cannot be restored when an execution is carried out, a lesser punishment undermines the value we place on protecting life. I sincerely apologize to anyone who may have been hurt or offended. So those are the words that he put forth once he got pushback.
And I think that speaks to Adar's earlier point of lack, even, I don't think that he had the best intentions, but say we want to play that game. I still think it is ignorance, it is lack, if we were to say that he did not even make the comparison to lynching, to not understand that assumption that hanging people should be something that we should do rests on the foundation that we have a just justice system, which we have seen in many ways, shapes and forms that it is not. And so it is just such an out of touch proposition because it's resting on something that we already have, what in mainstream has noticed is not just and disproportionately impacts Black people. And so that's my point is done now.
Thank you, Ebony.
I was going to add, as a white person, two things strike me most directly, and that is when we look at the history, we look at the photos of people, the audiences at lynchings, and who were there, who were watching what they did when they were there, this celebratory environment. That's the first piece. The second piece is how often the punishment fit the crime of coming up against a white person, usually a white woman. And so just really sitting with that as our history, the juxtaposition of whiteness against this practice in particular, just so deeply problematic that there is no way that you don't know, especially when you're from cultures and communities where this was practiced and where you see it in your history books and your families talk about it. It's just there's no way that you don't know exactly what that meant and what you are saying and what you're proposing.
But let's talk about the history books because they do want to change those. So it's I think that that is part of it too, that if we rewrite history as a country and say that things do not exist, things did not happen as they were, enslaved Africans were indentured servants and whatever else is in the new history of Black people in this country, I think then that helps to support, that helps to that gives power to this ignorance of we live in this society where everyone is equal and everyone has an opportunity to do the right thing. And our justice system is in fact a just system. So I think I think not enough people are connecting the dots of what is happening and how this gets to it can perpetuates racism and it perpetuates Black people being marginalized, killed, not included in the society that they helped build.
Yeah, it's almost like white people are trying to build another excuse as to why they don't understand the history. We'll just strip the books too. And that gives us even more of a rock to hide under when it comes to the truth.
So this guy was born in 1959, right? His grandfather or his people were in Tennessee long enough to have known about the last lynching in Tennessee, which was Albert, I think his last name was Williams, in 1940, only 19 years before Paul Sherritt was born, right? And in Tennessee, they used to call them lynching carnivals. And the victims were often tortured, eye gouged, genitals cut off, beaten, whipped, all of that. There's no way that this man did not know. There's no way that this man did not know. And even his, what I call his fall apology, because it wasn't an apology. Even the way that he talks about it as somehow he was proposing something within the boundaries of the judicial system. He was not, because lynching was not within the boundaries of the judicial system. Lynching was, and particularly for African Americans, outside of those boundaries, with white people taking the law into their own hands. He knew what he was saying, just as surely as he knows that there will be no consequences beyond a full apology for him saying what he said. And that takes me back to my point that so many white people in the United States do not have a problem with this. They don't see this as being central to them and their welfare, as long as it is not something that is going to be blatantly in their face. But the soft sell of it, the faux apology of it, is enough for them to say, we're going to let this go, and to vote for him again. He isn't the problem. The power that the majority of white people who voted for him, knowing his views, they're the problem, because they put him in office to set laws and policies over historically marginalized people. They know what they're doing.
Yep. Thank you for that historical context, Adar. And Adar, as you were talking, it made me think about the fact that lynching wasn't used just to punish that one person, right? It was used to terrorize the entire community. That's what it's about, right? You don't want to be the next one, right? Get in line, do what you're supposed to do, because you don't want this to happen to you next. And so by even just introducing it, by even just speaking it, by even just bringing it onto the floor, what does that do to Black citizens? Even just hearing it, even worrying about it becoming a law, right? That is terrorism. So yeah, I mean, these are things that are unacceptable, things that are not making, the nightly news, which is why we're talking about it here. Any other comments before we move on?
I just wonder if he had said something like, we're going to create a law that is going to profile and kill a lot of white men, or your husbands, or your sons or daughters or whatever, if that would have made the news. I mean, what does it take for a person in power to be able to put something forth like that, targeting a whole community, and it not even make the news?
But I think that I agree. And I think that is where that, for me, shows how dangerous raceless conversations are, because people, even if whoever is in the room hears that and they're like, yeah, criminals.
Right.
They just exist without race, without identity. We have no racial analysis around who gets that designation in our society. We're just talking about bad people. And I think that is why it's really important for us as a country, as a society, to lean into talking about race, because when we talk about who makes up this population, who gets that unjustly attached to them for very insignificant things or things that are not true. And oftentimes it's Black people. But when we use racelessness, or when people talk about policies and talk about things in a raceless way, creates this blanket, this cloak of deniability around everything that is actually racially charged.
Right, and that gets back to my point about the white racial innocence and the use of that for plausible deniability. I didn't take it like that. That wasn't what I heard. I didn't hear that as if there's absolutely no history attached to that. Yeah, agreed. And agree with the point that you made even before that, because it ties in that if this whole legislation in now 44 different states about deracializing those historical moments in terms of how we teach our history, right? And the history of this country, then that is what we're going to have. We are going to be able to completely deracialize, knowing that there is a racialized context and implementation. But America will be able to say, white America will be able to say, we didn't know that.
Mhm.
I was going to add too that because white America can largely, they're not going to feel terrorized, whereas other
Right.
folks are, and that's the point.
It's also making me think about how a lot of these arguments are being made about it's about safety, it's about crime and it's about safety and who's doing the crime and who are we trying to make feel safe, right? Yeah.
And you know what, if it really were about safety, then we would be talking about jobs, not jail.
Yes.
We would be talking about, just living wage, right? There would be things that we would be talking about. We would be talking about putting more money in education especially for historically marginalized communities. We would be talking about strengthening the public school system as opposed to private schools, select charter schools, right, with select clientele. If we really were talking about safety, our entire conversational frame would be different. And the fact that it isn't really lets us know what the conversation is about.
It's safety for who? I think, like, when I think about it, I think about safety for who, because I think even though people talk about things raceless, they are experiencing it in their brain with an image. And I think that oftentimes they are protecting themselves from something, and that thing tends to be in a Black body. And so when I think it's hard, I don't think many people, if they thought about who would be hanging, I don't think many white people would even, I don't think they are racially thinking that it's them. I don't think that they are going to think to themselves, they're going to see someone who looks like them, someone who looks like they're some loved one. I don't think that's even crossing their mind because it's unfathomable. And I do think that for Black people, it's immediate. It's like, I know exactly what that's going to look like because I've seen it and I'm aware of it. And so I think when people are talking about safety, and we see that there's this podcast about the nice white parents, I think, and they're talking about how they're about to integrate this school, and I think it's like kindergartners, like it's little kids, and this white community is talking about metal detectors and safety and all this stuff. It's like, this is a 5-year-old and a 5-year-old. What are you talking about? And I think, I don't think people think enough about who are you trying to be safe from, and like thinking if we thought racelessly about safety, it would be the things that Adar said. What killing people doesn't make you more safe. Like, what things make you actually safe and secure in society? Access to housing, access to healthcare, access to a meaningful role in community, whether it be a job, whatever, compensation for that role. Those things make you feel safe and secure. People being killed for things, that doesn't add to a sense of safety. Like, when you think about just in general as a human being, what we need for like be food, these things we need. Killing people is not a necessity for like our being, our wellness. And so So yeah, I don't think enough people spend time thinking about who do you need safety from, and why does that include death? And then like thinking separately about like, if it is about safety, what do you in yourself need to feel safe?
Mhm. Can I make one more comment about that? And it was from this Twitter exchange that I saw, right? And invariably, there is a white person who says, well, what about the 13% of crime that is perpetuated by Black people? Or what about, all this thing about crime? Not even making the connection between, so much of crime being, or so much of who is racially targeted and profiled for crime being about drugs that white people go to treatment centers for, right? Being about nonviolent crime, being about these things that are crimes of desperation because of lack of all of those things that you talked about, Ebony, or just the fact that police target low-income communities of color when the same things are happening in white, middle, and upper income communities. We don't have those conversations when people conveniently trot out these stats on who is committing what crime. So even the way in which society talks about these things, the way in which they racialize the outcomes without going to the racialized root, creates this false narrative that never gets corrected, and that sets up legislation, policies, laws, plausible deniability for all of the things that we see happening now in communities of color by policemen.
Exactly. And I also wanted to make the point that, and I was trying to find the date here really quick and I couldn't, that the death penalty we had done away with the death penalty here in this country, and then it was reinstated along the same time that the civil rights movement was happening, I believe. So that's another thing to think about. So all this time we had done away with it and then brought it back. And it hasn't made us any more safe. Thank you for that, you all. I want us to kind of circle back to another thing that we've been talking about tonight. As we've been talking about these issues, we've been bringing up the fact that there is this movement to not talk about the history of this country, right? There's been attacks on CRT, and basically just doing away with talking about the things that have actually happened in this country and how they are affecting us today. And like, let's just not talk about the history at all. And so Ron DeSantis in Florida has attacked the AP courses in his in his state, possibly in this country if he becomes our next president. And he did not want these African-American AP courses being taken in his state. And he even went to the level of just saying, okay, we just won't have AP courses at all in the state of Florida. So I just want us to talk a little bit more about that.
So he's threatening to make what did he say, the United States of Florida or something like that? He is threatening to Florida-ize the whole country if he is elected president, which is a threat, and one that I take very seriously because I know that he's targeting me and mine. Very much so. And, it's not a stretch to see him getting the nomination and possibly. Not a stretch at all. Not a stretch at all. What is so interesting is, I'm sorry, the Harvard University faculty where he graduated from was like, no, dude, you are so wrong in this. And he purports to be a history major. They're saying, you're wrong, dude. This is not it. This is not the look you want to go for. And he still is like doubling and tripling down, saying, well, if it has to be African-American AP courses, then I'll just get rid of everything.
Yeah. And the crazy part is that once again, when we talked about Sherelle from Tennessee and kind of acting like, oh, this is happening in a vacuum. I don't understand what I'm saying. I don't understand the implications of it, right? Ron DeSantis attended 2 Ivy League colleges, right? This man is very educated. He is not, he understands what he's doing. He understands the implications of what he's saying.
He's indoctrinated.
Yes.
Because his spin on history, again, he is not in the realm of reality in talking about US history. So either Harvard is a sham of a school in terms of its history program, or DeSantis, has been indoctrinated by what Harvard is teaching, or DeSantis got his degree how?
Right.
Okay, Ebony, you smart. What? What, Ebony?
Is the question how he got his degree? This is going on the internet.
I'm trying to figure it out. I'm trying to figure it out.
Degrees. I think I would challenge the audience, whoever is listening to this, to think about how people could be educated by the top institutions of our country and end up with these ideals and perpetuate these specific political views, and they are supposedly educated by the best of the best, and they have this stamp of approval from our top institutions in this country, or what is deemed the top institution in this country. I think that is something, I don't want to give the answer, but I think that people should take some time and think about how that could be, how they could get the stamp of approval from the highest, most prestigious educational institution in the US, and what that means about our education system, that this is a product of it.
Yeah, I was going to say too that what it says about constituents and who is in his echo chamber and who he is listening to and who is telling him that, yes, you're on the right track. This is right. This is what you should pursue, despite any other information to the contrary, that he's got clearly enough people telling him that, yes, this is the direction. I mean, these politicos, I'm thinking about Ted Cruz too, who I think also went to 2 Ivies, folks who are seem very out of touch, but then also are clearly paving a path for themselves that is really working for them on some level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think I would challenge, I wonder how, I think that we live in a society where, in the US specifically, where the folks politically, people know how to appeal, the charismatic leader and people who can appeal to people's emotions and fears. I think when I think about the book ban list, and a lot of the reasons why is because it makes students feel sad or uncomfortable. And
white students.
Yeah,
white
there we go.
students.
Sorry, thank you. Let me not be racist.
Mm-hmm.
It makes white students feel uncomfortable and sad, but then you grow up, these white students grow up to be these political leaders who then perpetuate the stuff that we are trying to educate people on, to try to stop, to interrupt this cycle, this vicious cycle that our country is in. And so yeah, I challenge people to, one, look at the banned book list, because it's not just Black authors, it's
right.
Handmaid's Tale is on there too. There are a lot of really beneficial books to broadening people's perspective on how the world looks and what the world could look like. There's a lot of dystopians on there that we are not too far off from. So yeah, people should really take a look at what the content that's being removed from or trying to be removed from our society, and think about why, and then also draw parallels to what is actually happening right now.
Someone said that when things like this happen and people come out with this false history, that they're either projecting or admitting guilt. And so when people talk about this whole indoctrination, you know, the more resources you give people, the more viewpoints, that is education. When you take different viewpoints away, when you restrict books, when you restrict information, you really are going toward indoctrination. So, you know, what is really happening here? Right. And when people say that it is the, oh my God, what's the thing, the moms for something, the all white moms group, and people are prioritizing them. Oh, it's this group. Oh, Ebony, this gets back to what you're saying about deracialized everything. On the news, people, they'll say this mom's group, parents are against this. Here's the moms group, moms against or moms for. And it's always a group of white women who are supporting the bans, who are, you know, talking about how they don't want their children to feel bad. And there is never conversation that, you know, why are these women all white? Why are there no women of color here talking about what gay children, what trans children, what Black children, what Latino children, on and on and on, how their development and their sense of self, right, is undermined by receiving a steady diet of messages that their people were invisible and are invisible, and that white people did everything that was supposedly great and none of the things that were not. So there were people who were enslaved, but white people didn't enslave them. It must be those monsters that nobody could see. You know, there were lynchings. It wasn't white people. It was, we don't know who. And you can't say that it's white people because little white children might be traumatized. And meanwhile, you know, other people's children have to live with knowing that there were people in their family who actually experienced these things.
Thank you, Adar. We're actually going to talk a lot more about that next month as well. We're going to talk about how historically white motherhood has been used to perpetuate white supremacy. So that was
Cannot wait for the conversation.
That was a really good little blurb for that.
About like the right to comfort too, because
Yes.
when we think about I don't see anything wrong with white children being uncomfortable with racist white history. I think white children should be uncomfortable learning about the ills of society that perpetuated by white people. And I think that is fertile ground for conversation on how to be different. And I don't understand why when we have the history that we have, why we would want to shy away, like this thing that the expectation that white kids can't feel sad or scared or disappointed is unrealistic. And in general, when we think about the development of people, it's not helpful to have a child never feel sad or disappointed, and you as a parent not being willing and able to build the skills to engage with your child on how to navigate feeling discomfort and disappointment and anger and disgust. Like, these are a part of the human experience, and all marginalized kids are grappling with those feelings. I think, like, when we think about kids not learning about their history, or knowing their history and knowing that it is not being taught, that is also a painful experience, and that is a conversation that they cannot be shielded from. And so I don't understand, me personally, I don't understand. I think for me, it points to parents' lack of confidence in their ability to navigate. I think, like, there's a lot of things, but I keep falling back on, you can't handle walking your child through discomfort and showing how you all are different. Is it because you're not different? Is it because, like, you can't point to how you're different from the history? Like, and I think that is where I'm, like, curious, like, Is that what the problem is? I don't know the answer. I'm not white, but I'm just curious.
So let me share this, and this happened this weekend, and I shared some of this with my colleagues. With a young person in my life who I was checking in with, shared with me, so guess what happened this week? What? Some of my teachers were going around calling children niggas. And I say that very deliberately. I'm not saying the N-word, because young Black children have to hear that from white teachers. We should all be adult enough to be able to handle the word instead of the euphemism, right? And I said, so what happened? What did you do? And she said, well, everybody was saying, oh, no, you can't use that word. Don't use that word. And then a teacher was talking about, I think that we need to have a White History Month. And so we had to talk about that. Right? To talk about like the difference between a Black person saying nigga and a white person saying it, the difference in power differential between a white teacher saying that and that white teacher having control over the grades that you are going to get. Because one thing this person was worried about was what happens if their parents go up to the school and make trouble. Then that young person still has to sit in this teacher's class, and their grade is still dependent on the teacher. So not wanting to make waves, not wanting to get in trouble because they have to be in that room for 5 days a week for a whole year. Right. And so the whole conversation about, oh no, we have to, our white children have to have a right of comfort that children of color never get to experience in any area of life. Because this same young person I had to have a conversation with when they were about like 3 or 4 years old, and their dad was first stopped for no reason, for a reason, as the policeman said, because he could. Stop the father, made him get out of the car, made him get on the ground in the dirt while he ran his license. We had to have that conversation, and for a long time, this young person, every time they saw a police car, oh no, because they thought that the same experience would happen again. This isn't new. This is Black and brown children across the country living with this every day. Yet all legislation is about the white child's right to comfort.
Mm-hmm. And there's a good point in the chat that like the children are not really even it. It's really about the adults and the adults' right to comfort and the adults' right to hide behind their children and say that they are protecting them from it, but really they are protecting themselves from coming to terms with the reality that we are living in. And that story, Adar, it hits me because I think that so many Black children have that experience, Black and brown children. And if you compound immigration on top of that, like so many Black and brown children know the fear of police and do not have the luxury of seeing police as their friend, as somebody to go to be in an emergency. They learn through seeing with their eyes at whatever age as a child how their parents in their Black or brown bodies are treated by the state, and knowing that if that can happen to the person who's supposed to be protecting me, then that can definitely happen to me. And so I need to do whatever I could. Like that lesson is learned without words oftentimes, and it's that I'm like, it makes it so hard. Like there are Black and brown children learning that in real time because they're seeing it and they're afraid for their lives in these moments because there is a police officer here or this person of the state here that can change their life in a second. And then there's this beautiful place that white kids get to live where there's a moment of time where, yeah, no, there is no violence in the world. And I really hope that white people think about that the life is happening around kids all the time. And so the fact that that's my cat, she agrees. And I think that I've lost it. But yeah, basically that.
Mhm, mhm.
Thank you, Ebony. Yeah, as I was listening to you all talk about that, I was just thinking about how historically there has been this, I was just thinking about historically, not just children, but white women, right? This whole thing, and I was thinking about like the cult of domesticity, right? This whole thing that's been built around this protection and this innocence of white women and children. And we have to shield white women and children from all of these evil things, and they can't know about it, and they're so pure, and that has these are things that have been built up historically within our society, these ideals. But thank you for that back and forth. I wanted to talk about some more legislation that is harmful, and I wanted to talk about how Republicans have proposed changing the retirement age to 70. And how that impacts, once again, as Ebony was saying, talking about things out, without putting the racial implications on it. If we were to change the retirement age to 70, there hasn't been any conversation that I've seen around how that affects Black people, how that affects Black men specifically. I believe Black men have the lowest life expectancy. I'm not completely sure, but I
No,
believe
they do.
Okay, so I would like us to talk about that.
Tammy, go.
Yeah, I was gonna just say, right, so we're talking about another way that something it's raceless, and on its face it looks absolutely reasonable. You weigh all these, the cost benefits, you look at the overall federal budget, you look at how money's being expended, and it makes perfect sense. And then you realize, when you dig down, that once you actually start to racialize it, there are problems. But of course, you'll never get it to pass if you racialize it. So it is sort of a catch-22. You want to be fiscally responsible overall. So I'm just, like legislators, federal reps across the country, right? As soon as you start naming that this will impact people disproportionately, then you're not going to get a thing to pass. And so it's this elephant in the room, if you will, that like it looks good on one level, but it really is not, it's not fair, it's not equitable when you actually dig into the details of how it will impact people and the number of people of color who will actually never reap a benefit, because the chances of them dying at a younger age are so much higher than white folks generally. And of course, this is systemic because of multiple reasons across a lot of things that Adar was naming earlier. But again, that problem of unracializing, not racing a thing, and making it look, frankly, whitewashing it so that it looks good, but you haven't actually dug into it to see what the actual impact will be.
Nope. So as you said, Michelle, the life expectancy for Black people is lower than anything, right? For Black men, I think at last stats were like, I think 68 years, which they won't even make it to 70 then. For Black women, I think it's about 74. Asian Americans have the highest life expectancy. Is it Latinos next? And then white people, right? And so everybody is going to be able to walk into the money that they have put in. Nobody will get all of it, but they'll be able to get some of it. But Black people will be the ones who do not get, who do not have the fullness of post-retirement life. So where does that money go to then, right? And it kind of reminds me of how Social Security started out with Black agricultural workers and domestics putting their money into a system that they were not eligible to get their money out of.
I was just looking at Anthony's comment and thinking, I think, right, if we sort of pull the lens out, we're also saying, okay, if the argument is that this saves money for the federal budget, saves money for what? Where else does that money go? What else does it fund? What other programs does it fund?
Mm-hmm.
And and then all kinds of problems there, right? Like, what are we looking to fund instead of people's retirements? And what does that whole image look like?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's gonna go scary. I think
there's also,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, there is also a relationship to work that is not being discussed here, right? This, as one person who is in support of this said, with people living well into their 80s, which again, he wasn't talking about Black folk, and then people getting to retire at 67, then that leaves a whole lot of life that they're going to do what? Sit on the porch, But the thing is this, at what point do people get to make the decisions about the next half of their lives? Because if we're having people, again, work to 70, then for a whole racialized group of people, they get no afterlife in this, in terms of Social Security, or just to be able to say, wow, I've been working since I was 17 years old, and I get to kick back and to decide that I want to make flowers, or I want to paint, or what. But people contribute to society even when they are not getting a paycheck. And to deny people that right to decide how they want to contribute in a way that is not within the very narrow paradigm of an economic engine is so short-sighted of the country. And it really feeds into this: if you're not working, then the value that you have is really the value that you have to society is really minimal, and you basically should work until you die.
Mm-hmm.
Which I'm thinking is amplified for Black and brown bodies. I mean, I'm having a moment over here where it's okay for Black and brown folks to work until they die. I mean, that sounds familiar.
Mm-hmm. It does. It does.
Right. I was thinking the same thing as Adar was talking, and under slavery, a lot of time, if you happen to live long enough to no longer be useful to your slave master, they would literally leave you in the woods by yourself, no resources, no community.
Mm-hmm.
That's what happened to you under that system, if you happened, to live long enough.
You know what? We also don't talk about the ageism. Try to get a job when you're over 50.
Right.
I mean, there is that, and so we never talk about the ageist component of this. And so basically the other thing that they're saying is, you know what, you can always get a job at McDonald's.
Mm.
You should leave your career where you have put in 30 years, right? And you should go back to working where you're going to be on your feet all day, where you are, making minimum wage. You should go where we need you. And that is using you as scrap labor, basically. It's saying that is where your function is, and that if you choose not to do that, then there is something wrong with you, not with the system. And it's deracializing who will be in those jobs.
Yeah, and I was also just thinking back to what Tammy was saying, like, if we save this money, what are we going to do with it, right? And I was thinking about the fact, I think something like over 60% of our national budget is used for our military, right? So there's all these things, as we talked about tonight, right, that we could be improving if we really cared about making this a safer, more just country. And instead we're using it to build more bombs, right? And, you know, what does that mean? You know, I went to the African American Museum in DC, and they had it was a depiction of all the wars that we've been in this country. And it was crazy to me how a lot of the wars went on longer than I thought they had, right? And when you look at it, you're like, this country has literally been at war since its inception and up until today, right? Like that we live in a militarized state, we live in a military state, and that is what we're funding. is our country going into other countries, you know, and colonizing internationally.
Right, and then thinking about which colonies, you know, which countries we're trying to colonize, which ones.
Right, exactly. But all under the notion of we're spreading democracy and we're doing good for the world, right?
So I wanted to continue the theme of legislation. And we have another bill that's being put forth in Texas. I believe Texas is the most popular state here tonight, where if a straight couple has 10 children, they will not have to pay any taxes. But apparently in the bill, if you have 4 kids, you get 40% of your taxes off, 5 kids, 50% off, and so forth. But once again, only for straight couples. So what do we think about that?
So the unspoken, right? The comments, who can afford to have 10 kids? But here's the unspoken part. It gets back to Ebony about the deracialization. They're talking about straight couples and straight white couples, because when a straight Black couple has a whole bunch of children, you know, we hear about welfare queens and fathers not in a home, even when studies show the Black fathers have the highest level of engagement with their children, whether they are custodial or non-custodial. So the rhetoric around that is very, very, very different. And they almost say the quiet part out loud, which is, you know, this replacement theory is bothering us. And so we need white women to have white babies, and we are going to pay you all to do that. So we like a step and a half away from a Handmaid's Tale is where we are.
Right. Any other thoughts?
Dar said it all. Yeah, there are plenty of communities that have lots of children and they have a lot of negative stereotypes attached to them. And so I think it's really important for folks to think about how Black and Brown people with large families are depicted in media, how they're talked about, how they have been considered in policy up until now, because when we think back to why Black fathers weren't in the home, how our policies around welfare perpetuated Black fathers not being in the home, or the family not having enough to support themselves and to feed their kids. And so I think it's important. This is like a policy without history. Again, we have always had policies that impact women, impact people who have children, and it's always negatively impacting Black and Brown people and people who have the least amount of access to healthcare regularly and things like that. So yeah, I think that it's definitely something that's very specific, because to safely have 10 children, that is a big flex these days. If you can have 10 children and feed them all and take them to school, I don't know how someone can do it. So yeah, like this incentive program is very much targeted towards a specific person, because it is so difficult to have 10 children right now. And we think about the communities that do have large families, And like that links to like access to reproductive health care, and like there's so many political ties to this that are the opposite for people of color. And so yeah, I think with every positive white policy, I think people should try to think back on what does this look like for Black and brown people? Like how does this topic show up for Black and brown people in like the policy and political history of the US?
Exactly. The other thing I was thinking about as you were talking, Ebony, is, Black maternal health statistics, right? So for a Black woman to have 10 kids, what is the likelihood that she would even survive that? You know what I'm saying? Like, because we don't even have, adequate care for Black pregnant women.
And also Black infants. Like it's not
Right.
like for Black infants to survive as well is something like so yeah. And in the chat, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how you can make 10 kids like profitable for somebody. So yeah, I don't know what exactly how big this tax cut is and what they're proposing and like what kind of life these children are gonna have. For the tax cut to be, I don't know, this just sounds like something to support. For me, when I hear it, it sounds like something to support the restrictions on reproductive rights. And so incentivizing forcing people to have babies, I think is what is really happening. I don't necessarily know if it's truly a tax cut or because in our country, we are actively gutting reproductive health rights. Oh my gosh, I'm not gonna say that. We are actually gutting reproductive health access. I think that this is to lighten the blow, so to say, for the white women who will be impacted, because reproductive health rights impacts all women of all races. Anybody who has a uterus and has potential to need care for that uterus, the ways that they are getting reproductive health care access is going to impact people. And so I see this as kind of just like a little distraction from the big kahuna, which is, I shouldn't say big kahuna, actually. The big deal, which is the attack on reproductive health rights.
Right.
I'm really glad you said that. Oh, sorry, Adar.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it just behooves us to always remember what other things are connected, what else is going on. Nothing stands in a silo. And I think Ebony's point is really important about sort of placating those who might be up in arms about abortion rights and other healthcare rights being taken away, that there's like, here's a carrot. Now will you come with us? We've given you this, maybe we'll give you more. It just makes things more palatable, and just to remember that nothing's by itself.
Yeah, because that's a big reason why a lot of people are not electing to have children. Like that's a big discussion. Like millennials aren't having babies because it's too expensive. So like, okay, we're taking away the right to protect yourself or like family plan. And here's this tax cut. So have more babies. And I think it all has to do with controlling women as well. And I think that there's like another conversation to be had about how men use policy and law to control women and keep them in their place, so to say.
The racialized discrepancy in the messaging, and one of the comments in the chat, I too was chuckling about Nick Cannon. And I mean, what's he on his 12th child or something? And, and he has been roundly condemned. Now, there are 2 shows about polygamy.
Too.
He
can afford them.
He can afford that, right? And he's still being roundly condemned, right? And the 2 shows about polygamy, I mean, people are making money off of that with 18 children. So Nick Cannon, he's got his tribe, and people are condemning that. you have a representative from Colorado who just announced that her 17-year-old son is having a baby with his girlfriend, who's like either 15 or 16, depending on what accounts you believe. And all of a sudden, you know, that is like the greatest thing since sliced bread, and a blessing, because rural white women got it like that, you know, and so appreciate the preciousness of life, which is what this representative said. None of that messaging would you hear if it were a 17-year-old Black woman or young woman or young man who were pregnant, and then all of these people would be coming out roundly condemning. So the messaging in this, and the fact that, again, in underreported news, nobody is calling out that racialized discrepancy of messaging. You know, nobody is connecting those dots. Mainstream media is not connecting those dots. And so these things, then every one of these things reads as episodic rather than as pattern, racialized pattern. And going back to parents maybe not understanding how to talk about these issues, you have mainstream media who also doesn't know how to talk about these issues, and who refuses to bring on as experts the people who could actually talk about these issues and make connections historically and with cohesion. They refuse to do that, which means that they're buying into the gaslighting of America in terms of keeping the message disjointed or making the racialized messaging invisible.
Thank you for that, Adar.
And I also
Let's say
want to
something,
say that I don't think that we should be condemning. Like, I do think that the same, what I hope is that the same type of support that white teen parents get is the same type of support that Black and brown teen parents get, where like things happen, people get pregnant, people have babies.
Right.
One is not worse than the other, but there is
Right.
definitely a difference in how those groups are handled. And then yeah, even Nick Cannon.
Right. And the thing is, if we were talking about life, and if we were talking about justice, and if we were talking about really, you know, justice in this country, everybody would be supported and have like a softer landing, so that they are not making choices out of desperation or discouragement or, you know, shame, right? And so, yes, I agree. Black and brown youth who find themselves in that position should be treated with that same respect and support, familial and public, as they strive to work it out and continue to grow to become, you know, the outstanding adults that they're meant to be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you all for this discussion. I really just want us to kind of be keeping with us the points that were made and that Adar was just making too, about just that, you know, nothing is happening in a vacuum, right? That these things aren't happening by accident, and just continuing to be critical and be thinking about how all of these things are connected. You know, we're living in interesting times. Who knows what's going to happen with this election coming up, but you know, this is, I don't think by any means the end of these kinds of things. I think we're going to continue to be seeing this type of legislation, and so just I'm hoping that these conversations continue and that we're all just more cognizant of the things that are happening around us politically, and how political power is being taken away from Black and brown people systematically as our numbers are growing. That is not by accident at all. But yeah, just very thankful for this conversation. Thank you, Tammy, Adar, and Ebony for joining tonight. I always enjoy talking with you all. and it's such a treat. But I wanted to close, Dana, with social media. So we do have social media. We hope that you follow us on YouTube. This recording will be on YouTube, and we hope we share it with others that weren't able to join this evening. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook. And we are a nonprofit, and we appreciate any donations that you all can share with us as we continue this work and workshops. And you can donate at bemoreantiracist.org/donate. And then next month, we're going to be talking about motherhood and white supremacy. We touched on it a little bit in this discussion, talking about how, white women and children are kind of given the privilege of innocence, and, that they should be protected from racism and learning about racism. And we're going to, definitely delve way more into that next month on April 13th. So we hope you all will join us. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.